Hello and welcome to Varn Vlog's Radical Engagement series. We continue our discussion of Alasdair MacIntyre's 1960 essay, Breaking the Chains of Reason. So far, in this essay, originally published in E.P. Thompson's collected in an E.P. Thompson collection of essays called Out of Apathy, published originally in London in 1960. We see here that MacIntyre is engaging with the development of the social sciences in brief. He's talked about Hegelianism failing and the return to positivism in the 19th century. He's talked about the anemic response on Britain and American academics. He's talked about Karl Popper and the Popper problems. Go back and watch the episodes, which I will link in the show notes, which go over sections 1 through 4. And today we begin section 5. If you have this copy, and this is a copy that's still in print easily in the United States, I believe in Britain too, which is Alasdair MacIntyre's Engagement with Marxism, edited by Paul Blackledge and Neil Davidson from Haymarket Brill. You can find this on page 157. This edition is from 2005. So even it's getting old. But anyway, let's continue. MacIntyre begins. Diseases know no frontiers. This is as true of intellectual as of physical disorders. If it were not so, we might treat the human sciences as an infected area that which could be quarantined off. Rather, as an anxious but misinformed middle-class parents in the 1930s hoped to shelter their children from Marxism by forbidding them to go to the London School of Economics. In fact, however, there is no discipline which is not touched by our present condition. Yet the vast quantity of detailed, specialized, hard-working study by means of which academic disciplines endure is apt to conceal this. For numerous tasks to hand distract from the attention to that total picture, without the possibility of which the individual task would no longer have any point. And where any sort of total picture does begin to emerge from the individual pieces of research, it seems to be just a consequence of the research, something whose acceptance is as inevitable as the results of chemical analysis or the dating of a document. This is Varn talking here. I find this to be true. I find that there are whole fields of study that infect other fields of study that have fundamental problems in their basic assumptions, that the construction of the field and study makes it hard to critique. And since that field of study might have the pretense to be in at least scientific, if not an outright science, although I've never seen how the levels of complexity involved in social science means that it actually could be a hard science in any meaningful sense, or even a science at all, in so much that we know what that even means. But what we have to deal with here is that we can look at individual pieces of research and comment on this and that, but if the field is rotten at the core, then what are you going to do? I often talk about this in terms of economics. The paradigms used in economics are some ways illustrative, but always bracket out key things that are needed to talk about economics. And most attempts to create disciplines which deal with those things, behavioral economics, German historicism, the institutional school of economics, etc., end up becoming removed from economics through other fields such as sociology, group psychology, etc. And we're not going to deal with the kind of biases that are in behavioral economics and how that in and of itself led to a whole range of ideologically questionable assumptions, of which are little empirical data. But nonetheless, I think MacIntyre is asserting that this problem is larger throughout the entire edifice of the academy as it exists in a capitalist state. And I don't think he drops this when he gives up Marxism either. Later on, MacIntyre will comment how even though he's a philosopher of ethics, that he thinks ethics classes are a joke and instrumentalized. And that breaking these things off in compartments like this do not help anyone actually embody or live them. After all, look at the Forbes young up and coming and figure out how many of them either are or are bound for prison. Back to MacIntyre. What picture, in fact, emerges? One in which the absence of central concepts of human nature and the non-historical features of the social sciences continuously invade other disciplines. It might be thought paradoxical that one should be above all true of history. After all, contemporary history is strikingly different from liberal history. The descent from the Whig view of English history as freedom broadening down to the present, to the precedent to H.A.L. Fisher's boast of being unable to discern any purpose or pattern in the historical sequence is a tale of the past. As a side note, this is pretty common now. If you ask historians, they don't try to do big pictures, which has led to the development of like the attempts at new historical sciences like cleodynamics, which use mathematics and large-scale models and aggregation, as well as narrative history, as well as archaeological history. Although there are methodological problems that I've seen in cleodynamics, they are trying to add that big picture back in because it's largely been kind of abandoned. Even the tendency towards microhistory, which I tend to like, often came out of people who had Marxist or Marxian frameworks, has been used to just talk about these frameworks as if everything is too generous and can't be compared and there's no real study and all we can really do is master the ephemera and details and basically triviality of a particular time and place. Now, all Marxist historians betraying my particular predilection. Of the Marxist academics, the Marxist historians are the ones I like the most. Marxist theorists are the ones I like the least. And Marxist economists are interesting, but often confused. But nonetheless, this fear of over-concluding runs rampant through the discipline today, and for good reason, but it leads to a discipline which seems anemic. It's different from the vast overclaims that one might find in, say, a Harold Bloom book, which claims that like Shakespeare invented the individual, or the individual didn't exist until as a concept until Christianity, or anything like that, which seems kind of ludicrous. Ludicrous from both the standpoint of human subjectivity and the relative consistency of Homo sapiens sapien throughout its history, way longer than we have recorded history for. Nonetheless, we must continue. Whatever the disciples of Namier have brought into historical studies, they have brought a realism about power and a cynicism about ideals, which is a change from the Whigs. And Whiggish history, as a side note, is the history that history is linear and always getting better. The example of modern liberal Whiggish history that tried to make a comeback a few years ago is Steven Pinker and the New Atheist Battle Angels of Our Nature. But in general, this is rejected by historians and most of everybody else. Let's pick this back up. All that one wonders is whether, having caught the Whigs bathing, they are not now merely wearing their clothes turned inside out. Just a side note, a lot of people just invert bad paradigms. I talk about this in like people just inverting anti-communism into anti-communism, or inverting imperialism into just anti-imperialism, which pretends that there's only one hegemonic power possible at a time, or inverting anti-imperialism into anti-imperialism without claiming to be pro-imperialist, but somehow they don't miss that double negatives do that. This is part of the logic of me always advocating for socialists to take a unique positive position as well as a critique. Because critique without a positive position is nitpicking. Anyway, back to MacIntyre. For history has now become the history of the arrangement of power. Foucault, Althusserians, listen up. He's calling out you guys before that's even happened yet. Which, by the way, is a tendency in France that happened before Althusser and Foucault. but betrays Althusser's and Foucault's institutional bias in French historical studies, of which they weren't, but they were definitely embedded. The Namierite attention to the day-to-day events of the rise and fall of politicians in the reign of George III, for example, works in the assumption that it is almost a work of nature, that there are positions in which are positions of power and influence, and positions which are not. Given ladders up and down, which are rulers ascend and descend, their climbing can easily be described. But is it adequately described if we never ask how the ladders came to be there? The attention to the individual cases of power holding, power gaining, and power losing may appear superficially to underline the activity of individuals, but it does not raise questions of context. Excuse me, I've misread that. Because it does not raise questions of context and in fact presents the individual as hemmed in by social circumstances, always responding to external power and never fully autonomous and a responsible individual. For example, a recent account of the Peterloo massacre. The government had to keep public order and rely on local information. They never wielded. The local magistrates felt what that they, understandably in the context of time and place, took as a seditious uprising. The troops were under orders from the magistrates. No individual is responsible, and since the story contains nothing but the doings of individuals, there is no responsibility to be ascribed. The system in which things happen is accepted as a framework to the story in such a way that it never appears inside the narrative as a culprit. There are no culprits. When the readers of such histories report to us that the ideals and aspirations have no historical leverage, and that what matters is power, the reply should be that the powerlessness of ideals is written into the methodology of this sort of history from the outset. This is the other side of the sociological coin. We have seen how Popper's rejection of the equation of social science with history reflects in sociology. Now we see what it reflects in history. With history and sociology in the state, it would be strange if political theory were not similarly placed. What should we deduce from the state of political theory would have in these circumstances to be? If we reckon with the actual state of the human sciences and history, it would have to see developments as self-making processes or tradition, since men cannot consciously or rationally move it. The role of reason in this development would be at best that of the understanding or the recording after the event. What reason could not hope to do would be to describe the event. Since it would be an illusion to suppose that reason might do this, political rationalists would not be just intellectually mistaken, but politically and morally dangerous. Since political activity cannot be rationally guided, how shall it take form? The only possible answer is that it should be adaptive, a matter of knowing how to secure the safe passage of institutions we inherit into the changing circumstances with the least possible derangement and disturbance. If we were to ask for the political theory to be tailor-made to fit the state of social sciences and history, this would have to be its contents. But a tailor has anticipated our needle and already done the job, and the clothes are being worn. For this, none other than the political theory of Michael Oakeshott, conservative political theorist from Britain, who I've read, and he's kind of strange. A theory which has certainly the merit of being both self-confirming, since it is so splendidly adapted to the prevailing climate. It is almost superfluous to point out that to the profoundly conservative and anti-revolutionary nature of the theory. If creative, rational human activity has disappeared from the intellectual scene so thoroughly, why has it done so? The answer to which I am approaching is that our social life and our intellectual vision reinforce each other. Our social life is one in which human activity is rendered uncreative and sterile. We live in a society of grooves and ladders, a society created out of human activity in which human activity could abolish. Yet, it cannot simply be reasoned out of existence. Reasoning can give direction to human activity, it can make it effective, but there must be human activity to be informed and directed. Where is it? It is wherever those whose lives are most made and imposed upon them, the working people and the industrial, and then in the colonial centers, revolt against the conditions of their life. Cut off from these revolts and overimpressed by the reports which sociological explorers have brought back from the proletarian jungle, these intellectuals see the working class as being the most helpless, inactive of all groups. Side note, I will actually notice this. A whole lot of sociological theory actually assumes all classes but the working class are active. In fact, I was even complaining about this in Peter Turchin and Michael Lind. They see the petite bourgeoisie, the professionals, the overclass. The overclass is like the political elite and the bourgeoisie. The lumpen and other societies, peasants is all being active, but the working class is not. It's inert and just signs one of the many factions of the other classes, according to that theory. They come from a mechanically molded and conditioned way of life, and they describe what they see in mechanized and deterministic terms. Then their own concepts blind them and to those whom they speak to there being any alternative possibilities. This is MacIntyre preempting Mark Fisher, or even Jameson, or even the guy Jameson was writing about, by 3 to 5 decades, depending on which of those people we're talking about. The vices of our lives and errors of our concepts combine to keep both in being. How great the intellectual pressures are that may perhaps best be grasped by looking at the typical distortions to which generally independent thought in our culture is subjected. For the two greatest thinkers of our age were Freud and Wittgenstein, both of them conscious inhabitants of a fallen world whom lived through the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Both of them thought against the intellectual climate of their time. What is interesting is the way in which each has been domesticated and rendered harmless by spreading abroad of versions of their theorizing from which all the bite has been removed. Freud was in revolt against the mechanistic climate of the age. That was so has been concealed by most of his expositors, not the least of him himself. He abandoned neurophysiology in the search for the causes of neurotic and psychotic disorders in order to connect them with the motives and desires. He invented a technique whereby one could become conscious of the unconscious motives and therefore free oneself from their compulsive hold. He saw in the rational comprehension of desires the path to freedom. We can free ourselves from the infantile demands which oppress, and we make ourselves. We can pass from the superego morality to the morality of the ego ideal. As to the content of the ideal, Freud stopped short. Honesty, reasonableness, a care for people, having been prescribed a practice of life dominated by these, he would not ask how such a life could be realized against the weight of our social institutions. This then becomes a vulnerable point at which his interpreters are able to rewrite him back into an adaptive and deterministic setting. At the level of therapy, the ideal, especially amongst the American neo-Freudians, has become one of adjustment, of fitting the individual into a social niche. At the level of theory, the explanation of the unconscious motivation becomes not a prelude to freedom, but a prelude to explaining away social dissatisfaction as neurotic. We treat the path here from the important to the trivial, from Freud to Kingsley Amis. Slam. That was me. And I think there's actually something true about that. And true about this as we've seen in America with the attempts to reduce all of psychology to neurology or psychopharmacology. It's not that psychopharmacology might not have positive effects and be good, but we also know the limits of it. We know that many psychopharmaceutical drugs, such as SSRIs, would not be approved if they were for non-psychological conditions. It's just they don't have any other things that really have that kind of efficacy. Furthermore, there's been a general critique in the last, say, 10 or 15 years about psychology focusing on the individual and about individuals fitting in, so much so that psychologists now talk about it and complain about its limitations, that the therapeutic is itself a social technology that even many therapists are beginning to doubt. But you can see here in 1960 that someone like Alasdair MacIntyre was aware of the problems. It wasn't hard to see. Freud is not that long dead at this point. I mean, he's pretty dead, but we're not 3 or 4 or 5 generations removed in 1960 like we are today. Which is also to say that some of these developments in neurology have not been super helpful, but they've tended to be less helpful than predicted. Anyway, back to MacIntyre. When the Nazis burnt Freud's books, they testified to the essential anti-fascism of his stress on rationality and freedom. The next stage is that of the Kessler novel Arrival and Departure, where the hero discovers the roots of his anti-fascist activity and repressed guilt as a forgotten injury which he had done to his brother in childhood. But at least Kessler's hero goes on as an anti-fascist, with Amy's in Kingsley Amy's here, in his Fabian Society pamphlet on socialism and the intellectual, the watering down and the misunderstanding of Freud reaches its climax. Politics is a matter of temperament. This is particularly true in people like Jonathan Haidt, who think politics can be explained by genetic temperaments. Just want to point that out. Love of the established pulls you to the right and hate of it to the left. And behind, again, lies perhaps your relations with your parents. Amy's 1957. No hint is here that those whose adult politics are merely patterned after their relationship with their parents need to be freed and can be freed. No hint is here that one might free oneself through social action. Or take the case of Wittgenstein. Wittgenstein is a philosopher about whom it is hard to write without distortion. His own thoroughness, patience, and integrity mean that he never elaborated his views easy enough to be fitted into neat summaries. If I pick out from his, though just one theme, it will indicate again the type of intellectual pressure that is at question. A variety that tangles in philosophy have arisen around the view that we are able to talk about our experiences because our words are names for specific experiences in which they have become associated. I know what red or pain means because I have seen red lights or felt pain, and the words and experiences have come to be marks which remind me of those experiences. Against this view, Wittgenstein argues that what matters is the use to which an experience can be put in the context of human activity, its role, point, and purpose. Consider a word like cow. Norman Malcolm, expanding on Wittgenstein, has commented on on an imagined case where man utters a certain sound every time that a cow appears, and said that, quote, meta quote, we need to ask what makes the latter sound a word and what makes it the word for cow. Is there no difficulty here? Is it sufficient that the sound uttered when and only when cow is present? Of course not. The sound might refer to anything or nothing. That is, it need not be a word any more than if I suffered from a nervous tic of the head every time I saw a cow. The movement of my head would be a word. Then Malcolm says of the sound in question, quote, meta quote, what is necessary is that it should be playing a part in various activities, in calling, fetching, counting cows, distinguishing cows from other things, and the pictures of cows from the pictures of other things. If the word has no place in activities, language games of this sort, then it isn't a word for cow. To be sure, I can sit in my chair and talk about cows and not be engaged in any of these activities. But what makes my words refer to cows is the fact that I have already mastered these activities. They lie in the background. This supposition makes it clear how, for Wittgenstein, language is essentially social. Asterisk, this is Varn, adding in, language is never private. There is no such thing as a private language. Kripke talks about this in Wittgenstein, but just in general, this is true for Wittgenstein. Language games are games which people play. You cannot denote the structure of the language outside of the context in which that structure exists. Which is why axiomatic definitions are both necessary but never sufficient. Because the games always change. Back to MacIntyre. Language is essentially social, essentially a matter of human activity, and not at all to be understood mechanistically. It recalls Marx's own assertion that language is practical consciousness. Yet, in many accounts of Wittgenstein from both hostile and sympathetic viewpoints, everything has been turned upside down. Wittgenstein set out to elucidate ordinary language. He is represented as having tried to argue from it. Instead of the purpose of the concept of use, we get the naturalistic concept of usage. The philosopher's task is not that of understanding the standards for success in language using. It is the bleakly conservative one of recording and classifying how we all talk anyway. Language is not something that men do and make. It becomes merely a part of the given and made environment. This sort of reinterpretation fences around Wittgenstein's thought just at the point in which it might help us break free from the prevailing miasma. Thus, in every field, there has come to be its own intellectual conservatism protected against change by an alleged impossibility of change. The villain of this piece, which ought to be clear by now, is not just the scapegoat so often invoked, positivism. Positivism, with its narrow view of rationality, its acceptance of physics as a paradigm of intellectual activity, its nominalism, its atomism, its lack of hospitality to all the general views of the world. Positivism, with all these merely recorded after the event, what intellectual landscape of our culture has become. Those who could not bear to hear what it reported fled, often not from an alien force, but from the mere image of their own minds. Now here, MacIntyre is reflecting some of the criticisms of positivism of the Frankfurt School, but unlike the Frankfurt School, he actually states what he thinks is at stake clearly, which Horkheimer and Adorno are not known for doing, and which makes their own work actually really abusable by people wishing to assort it towards positivistic ends. But nonetheless, we should have to think about this. Why are these radical philosophers hemmed in by the study of themselves? Why are they made concessionary to the status quo, then fall away, etc.? MacIntyre is concerned with the atomization of our ways of understanding the world and the atomization of a broad picture of history, and the fact that we remove sociology from history as such, not being able to delineate what is trans-historical and what is historical meaningfully in the terms of sociology because we've abstracted it so much, often trying to make sociology appear as physics or cybernetics or some other thing based in math, quanta, and something easier to foresee. Or we look at the microscopic and treat each thing too generously as if it doesn't have connections. Now, this is a broad-based assertion, and there will be counter-tendencies to statistics, but one of the things that I find fascinating is how much of this is still true 60 years later. After all, MacIntyre wrote this 20 years before I was born, and probably 40 years before a lot of you were born. We'll continue with this essay soon, and I hope you get a lot out of this. I am.